Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is S.C. Coleman, author. In this video, we're going to be talking more about the cabal structure, the elements who attempt to essentially embody the hidden hand behind a so-called modern or public society. So this group you could call the Cabal, but that's not specifically related to the book, the Kabbalah, or any quote-unquote Kabbalistic activities. There's many other words for such organization, whatever you will. And one word that is particularly fitting is empire. So this you can consider the history of the Cabal Empire. But even that doesn't quite accurately explain what we're looking at. The book series, The Keys to the Kingdom, is pretty much the best representation of what we're talking about. And it's done in such a way in those books that the message, if you will, is not readily apparent. So it can slip under the control of the censorship mechanism, because those that operate the censorship mechanism generally do not have the capabilities of deciphering such elaborate instruction. So the first thing that we're going to look at here with the history is that, well, we need to understand that history, what we consider to be history, which is documentation of a timeline of a series of events, things that have happened to where we get to this point, and then current times. Most consider that to be history, usually not including future events into that. Some people might argue or believe or say that future events do factor into history. But either way, we are not taught, the majority of us anyway, are not taught what actually happened in history. What we're taught is a story about what happened. But the first thing that we need to understand is the history of the Cabal. We are taught pretty much only a version of that, but the reality of it is a little bit different. It's the history that specifically relates to them. Most of it, strangely enough, will be centered around the European area of the planet. The first thing to start with is the search for a lost power. This is a pattern which replicates in many different areas. And it's the idea of bringing about the end of the world. Similar to the Ring in Lord of the Rings, the Lord Sauron constantly searching for this ring to give him the capability to essentially destroy all freedom and life on the planet of Middle Earth. But you find this idea of bringing about the end of the world in many areas. You also find, individuals going around constantly, it's the end of the world's ending, the sky's falling type of thing. But the search for the lost power is also evident in resurrection rituals, in raising of Lilith, the goddess of death, all the different, quote-unquote satanic rituals where they try to bring about the end of the world, Ghostbusters, right? You've got, throughout all of these different examples, you have this idea that You need to go out and search for something, or that there are those going out and searching for something, which will then give them the power, or maybe not give them specifically the power, but will usher in an era of destruction and death and darkness and things like that. But this idea of the search, end of the world and search for lost powers is a little bit more in depth as it concerns what you might think of as unrecorded historical events, but even before things like Sargon of Akkad and all that stuff. So that means that we need a starting point, which will not unfortunately go very far back in relation to the true extensive history of these things. It will only begin at the Bible area or era, which are what I call the story times of the fishmonger. In this era, fishmongers, being those that sold fish at markets, would tell people stories while they were being sold fish and things like that. Those connected to the fishing trade. Now this had a lot to do with the sea powers at the time, most of which spoke a language similar enough to what we now call Greek. And this is something you'll find a lot with the Kabbalistic control structure, is that there's always, when it's them doing it, there's always a language which is they attempt to impose everywhere on the planet, but is in fact being shared by all of their minions and communicated among each other, and their singular perspective is that they're the only ones in existence and everything else has to conform to them. So that's why you get things like that. Now in the fishmonger story times, you have certain things to notice. You have Phoenicia, Greece, the Hellenic inclusion of the Hellenic concept, the statuesque stuff, the hell, right, heaven and hell, that type of stuff, Hellenes. And you have the Biblia, or Bible, meaning books. You of course have the Phalanx, right? We've got the F with the PH, part of the Phoenicia type of thing. You have the ark, which is the sail. Arco being a curve is an arco. You got arco y flecha in Spanish, which is a bow and arrow. You have the Ozarks, the Osage, Arkansas, right? You've got a lot of this arc stuff. It has to do with the sail in this context, though. The ability to travel via sail is a symbol of the sea peoples, of which there were, of course, many, not just Phoenicia. You also had the proliferation of the spiral around the planet, because the sea peoples were traveling everywhere and putting the spiral, and of course the Maori, various different groups all over the planet, ancient, old, quote-unquote indigenous groups, they're all connected to the sea peoples age, as they carry many of the cultural imprints from this period. Carthage, of course, was a big one, but the most often overlooked one above all else, more important than so-called Phoenicia or Greece or Carthage or any of that, were the Gaels, or in other words, the Gallic, the Gauls, or the Welsh of Wales. That's, of course, where you get the similarity in the word gale as meaning a wind storm. Of course, you could think of it more like a storm of people coming on a fleet of ships. And naturally, they're also the ones that created the style of the longship. later attributed to the Vikings. The Vikings, of course, being a word for essentially sea pirate, or an activity more like, which is going out and plundering at sea, Vikinger, whereas in fact they would have never been referred to as Vikings. So the next period that we go into is the Empire and the Split. Now from this period, you can think of sort of as the establishment of a more human related structure, but the inevitability of its collapse comes that it's a military structure taking over in opposition to the Kabbalistic control structure. But it inevitably breaks up. Now, from this period, you get Rhodes, which is interesting in relation to Rhodes, the geographical feature and the island, and then in this context, I'm talking about the walking and travel pathways, the encampment or camp, and of course the word camp, which in relation to military camps, and how they're set up with the crossing. The cross being a marker for the crossroads, the crossing of the roads, right? The cross becoming the symbol that it is today started as a representation not simply of a geographical, but essentially like road signs, right? That's really what they were. They were road signs. And then of course you have the word barbarian with the obvious use of the word bar, B-A-bar, and B-A-R, barbar, which naturally sounds similar to tar, doesn't it? You of course have the inclusion of the word Rome, R-O-M-E, which is of course also where we get the word R-O-A-M, meaning to wander, but is also in fact using the word Rome, and it's an anagram. If you switch to the M between the O and A, you get Roma, being the alleged name of the city Rome. But it actually has nothing to do with the city at all. It has to do with the activity of roaming. That's also the time period, or this is a time period in which you get the Vikingers to come out, and the Norman or Northman, and naturally the idea of a standard, not just simply being a physical object, but also being something that is quote-unquote uniform throughout different areas, and everybody knows how to use it and everybody picks it up. And that's the reason why you get things like the escudo, shield formation of the Romans being representative of the Scandinavian warfare with the shield wall. And also the fact that their armor seems similar, and they have a bunch of other similarities that are used everywhere. That's because this empire militarily sets itself up, and then it splits, and all these people have their stuff, their attire in a standardized format with minor variation. Now, something that we should understand is that these eras are not being exactly made by the Cabal structure, but that the Cabal structure is embedded within these regions and within these eras. And they represent it, well, we're taught just a false narrative, but they understand sort of how things work, where once you set something up in nature, it's destined to fall apart, right? They say this stuff all the time, sort of life cycle. And what they try to do is they try to navigate it as the quote-unquote leaders of it. But in some cases, the actual demise is in fact, the demise of naturally human things is in fact instigated, and these periods that I'm talking about, it's very easy to determine which is the Kabbalistic control structure based on the fact that they have a shared universal language, if you will, being used among them, because they all have to be on the same page in order to function. And if they're not, then they can't function at all, which is a little bit different from humans. Humans can disagree about things, but still kind of get things done based off of a mutually shared interest. And there could be a difficulty with communication, with language barriers and a whole bunch of other things, and all those things will be surmounted creatively by humans. The Kabbalistic minions and elements within this structure are not capable of this. The humans who work for the Kabbalistic structure are considered to be children, or the Piper's children, as the Keys to the Kingdom uses it, and they have to have their brains washed, or washed between the ears, basically, meaning their memory erased every so often, and then they get, retaught the same garbage, which is the practice in the school system of brain dumping, is the word for it. When you cram before a test, or you just study before a test, study, that is that word, stud, E. And then you brain dump afterwards, meaning you don't need to keep hold on to any of the information because you already took the test, and that's the only purpose that it was there for, was just to write paperwork and get a quote-unquote grade. And then you just get rid of all that information. And there's your brainwashing right there. You're washing between the ears. Now the next period is reforming and religion. This is where you get the word religion, which is in fact religion. And the Reformation period, referencing Martin Luther, being the reforming. Whenever somebody says that that we need whenever somebody says they practice a religion, that is an illogical, grammatically illogical phrase, because they're saying that they have a religion. Now, to religion is in reference to the Roman legions, meaning restructure that or type of organization. Of course, that's without actually completely understanding. And what obviously they're talking about is reforming militaristic control structures for their purpose to go around and, essentially speaking, conquer the planet, right? That's what they're talking about. They're reforming their legion within their context of the quote-unquote religion. So this is where you get the crusade, or the crossing, meaning the operative word crusade, or to cross. And you can even think about it as a crusade, meaning the crossing of a noun, the cross crusade. It's like activity noun, which would be Cruceade. Then you have the Venetian Republic, which set up the monetary standard for many centuries later through around the money market. Right, we hear that word a lot, the money market. A lot of those concepts came out of the Republic of Venice, with the Doge and the ability of mastery over coinage specifically. And they did a whole bunch of other stuff. They regulated the standard of weights and measures around the globe simply by determining where you could turn a profit by buying here and selling and all that stuff. So essentially the little game that we have today, only it was real at that time. You of course have the Holy Roman Empire. You could in fact change that around to the Holy Roaming Empire, because that's exactly how it's set up, where throughout all the different empirical electorates, a new emperor would be chosen from different electors, and that's how it sort of roamed around. You have the Hussar. You've got a pattern here in the vocalization of words. The Hussar, Hussite, Huguenot, Habsburg, of course, have the burgher, and then you're going to have the Palatinate, which came from around, from the Crusade period, the Palatinate, and came up to around the late or middle 1700s-ish, 1758, something like that, when I believe that the end of the Palatinate was because of the Prussian of that word, right? Sounds like Hussar, right? Prussia, Hussar, Prussia. The double S, and then the vocalization of the Hussar, right? Or Husha. So Prussia beat the Palatinate forces of Gustavus Adolphus, and that appears to be the end of the Palatinate. Of course, the Prussian system seems very similar to that of the previous era of the dissolution of the empire, when all things were standardized, but they weren't centralized, which is big difference. And the Kabbalistic structure specifically resented the destruction of their Reformation and re-legioning aims by Prussia. Now, the language for this period was or is to be called Latin. And this was a detraction from Greek, even though technically speaking, Greek was never a singular language. That's simply the label ascribed to it later on, and it's the same thing with Latin. That's a label ascribed to it later on. Not what it was called, it was just simply the quote common language being shared during that time period. And Latin does not quote unquote predate anything. Once you get into the idea of Etruscan and things like that, actually studying sort of these little breaches in the system, the little cracks in the narrative, stuff becomes more apparent. Latin is simply an overlay explanation for a language shared by the Kabbalistic minions at that time. Now, the next period that we get into is going to be our Merchant Rebellion period. Now, interestingly, once we get past the Reformation and religioning period with the breakdown of the religious control, we get into the more so-called civilized era, of which the main language spoken then is going to be French. The words here that are important are pirate or pedot, politique, which is where we get our word political, purchase, which is a interesting element related to pays or pays, P-A-Y-S, relating to country and people, but having to do also with paying for something, the purchase, which of course you've also got a in that word the purse, the purchase, you got a purse, right? If you take out the C and H, you got purse. Then you have the word république, where we get the word republic. So it's republic, and then the word public. You also have the use of the word colonies. Colon is the Spanish word for Columbus. So obviously there's something going on with this word Columbus and colony. And the colonies are specifically lied about by the Kabbalistic control structure. And it doesn't actually have to do with the colony you could think of as a trade hub being established by groups of people, and they operate this trade hub in a certain way. You have, of course, the colony of Macau. And during this time period, it's important to note that there was a lot of trade wars and a bunch of other things like that. Next, you have the Reconstruction period, and the language for this will be German or Dutch. Technically speaking, the same language, but the Germanic sort of language will be prevalent and will be established during this time period. And here you get these idea of work camps. Now, this is evident in the quote-unquote south of the United States, in which you have the establishment of these work camps where people get sent out to do work on these worker farms, areas that they're to go work in order to function the reconstruction of this Kabbalistic empire idea of the religious empire, right? The relegioning of forces. So they need laborers for that, and thus they have these work camps. This is also where you get the work camps in South Africa, which the British used as well. And naturally, it was the same individuals that set up the work camps, or were behind the setting up of the work camps in South Africa, that did the work farms in Reconstructionist period United States. This, of course, is where we get the idea of the next area. But we also have, in this period of Reconstruction, the Wild West, syndicates, and societies. This is the time period when you have, quote-unquote, civilized wars, the Civil War. Next thing we have is the People's Storm. The People's Storm rises up out of these work camps, these work farms, in which individuals are forced to labor for the benefit of this empirical structure. Well, all those workers get together and they rise up against the empirical religious structure, and thus you have the period of the People's Storm. Now you notice a lot of these elements. There is a particularly deep-seated resentment among Kabbalistic minions for certain things, and among those, other than just the word Prussia, specifically just that word Prussia, is the Volkspistol, the pistol of the people, the Volkspistol. Folk being a word used for the people, not in the current way we use it for something old, folk music. Well, that just means people's music. So are you telling me all the other music isn't for people? Another word is Rhodesia. That's a very interesting element. That's an interesting place, not just because it gets ascribed to the term Nazi to it, but you also have a lot of other things. You got the People's Republics, right? You've got the the Soviet Union and all that whatnot. But it all revolves around this term worker and labor and all that stuff, which has taken on a completely different nature today. Either way, at that time period, you have to understand that that's coming out of the previous time period of Reconstruction, in which there are all of these huge, massive, coerced labor camps and farms and things like that. And then you have arming. You have the final solution, that sort of concept there, a final solution. Final solution to what is, of course, the big question. And then the arming, mass arming, the arms race, all of this stuff around arming. Then the next period after that is reunification, and that's kind of the period that we're actually coming out of right now. The operative language for this, the language shared among the Kabbalistic structure for operational purposes, is called English, and it's the one that's spoken by most people today. It's the version that most people learn, not the quote-unquote British English, but rather the standard English. And in this period, you have the United Nations, NATO, North American Treaty Organization, the use of the word global and globalism, the weapons of mass, anything like that, assault rifle, mass shootings, mass murder, all of this stuff to use the word mass, and that obviously is a connection to the Catholic Mass, right? That word. Massive is another one, massive, right? Being of either far-reaching size or something like that. So there you get your word mass. You also, of course, have the ubiquitous use of the word health, tech, or technology. And this is where we get the grid, meaning the surveillance grid, the control grid, the grid square pattern of city development, and things like that. So this is the period that we're coming out of, and we will be going into or are already beginning to be in the human harmonization period, which will have an emphasis on travel, food and water, the return to nature, as it were, exercise, the mind, body, soul connection, vision, being able to see, the awakening, long life, energy, restorative energy, and all that stuff. It's not, you can't think of it this as a time to get back to old roots. Is it the way that it's being presented is that we're going to quote unquote regress into the dark ages and all this other nonsense, with the idea that we're just going to go around, we're going to forget all about quote unquote modern technology, and we're going to go back to doing things the hard way, the long way, all that stuff. It's ridiculous. The best way to look at this is a focus on revitalization or reviving the good practice, naturally functioning, well preserved, a well-made self. Not just about your physical self, but your mental self, all this stuff. So you do things to try to rebuild your effectiveness and efficiency as you are. And that's the way that you're returning to nature. It doesn't have to do with going out there and, making up a coal forge and hammering out knives and stuff like that. It really has to do with meditative practices, with supplementation, eating healthy, exercise, things like that, And it's portrayed in this other way as not just as a desire to undermine it, but also as a way to sort of try to get people to not, to reject this idea of returning to a natural self, focusing on your own self, because that's going to go against what we've been in before, which is this health maintenance structure, which makes you perpetually sick so that you can be maintained in a format that's more helpful to the Kabbalistic control structure. So that's what we're getting away from. We're getting away from the sickness health control structure, and we're going more into this redemptive, bettering the natural form and natural self, natural state, and broadening concept. So this is obviously going to be necessary for future periods, because in order for us to get into future periods, you have to be physically and mentally capable of doing so. But this is going to transition into the regathering and reclamation or reclaiming period, of which the operative language will be called something similar to human. It'll be the human language, meaning a language shared by all humans who probably have something to do with symbolism and things like that. But we'll have some sort of spoken version and whatnot. It will be in this period that we transition away from the English name to a language that's more, that they're going to call human, but this is going to be the operational language of Kabbalistic control structure. And they're already preparing for it, if not already in that phase for themselves, with their land banks, the water control and air quality, mineral rights is going to be an issue, the gravitational equilibrium, and maintenance of quote-unquote natural resources, of which humans are lumped into that. So they are, in this period, reclaiming the natural resources, as they say, and their mechanisms set up to do it right now are doing that. Within all these periods, there's always these embedded Kabbalistic elements who try to get out ahead of it and take the position in front as leaders. Sort of like if you had a group of runners, they try to get out ahead of it as the faster runners. They try to look like they're the ones, quote unquote, leading the pack. It's all about the appearance of things. Now, after this period of them reclaiming all the natural resources, so to speak, which there's a couple ways they'll reclaim it with their air quality control. They'll poison the air, and then they'll come along and say, we're the only ones who can regulate it because the air needs to be cleaned up, but of course they're the ones that poisoned it in the first place. Same thing they'll do with water. They poison the water, and then they come along and say, we need to clean up the water that we poisoned. The land banks is all about property rights and things like that, of purchasing land, and they use their phony financial control structure and mechanism to do this. And the mineral rights is going to be the same thing, but similar. It has to do with the natural resources, quote unquote, raw materials. Gravitational equilibrium is going to be very important because the equilibrium of gravitational structure, the gravitational structure as it's called, which is not we don't have to repeat that, it's not a force, but that relates to the material makeup of things, and once you start screwing with the material makeup of things, you begin to affect the gravitational equilibrium, which that's very important, especially for the next period, which is ascension, which is the idea of gravitational mastery, and considering we're around the period of reunification and human harmonization, my own perspective, all I can do, it's just like somebody who lives in the 1800s trying to write about current time period. It's going to be represented in the perspective of the individual. And my perspective is embedded in this time period, so while I'm talking about these future things, I'm of course coming in from the conceptual understanding of the time period in which I'm living. So for the ascension, you got gravitational mastery, the expansion of conceptualization and the ability to conceptualize a concept, and the what some might refer to as the sci-fi world. This is the getting your boat legs and moving off planet into the galactic universal outside our planet's sector, of which this is in relation to humanity doing it. Not these Kabbalistic companies or fake governments or any of these things saying that they've sent rockets out and all this stuff and they're in space. Like, whatever it is, the fake moon landing and all that stuff, that wasn't humanity going into space, because if it were, then we would all be able to just jump on a ship here or there or do whatever we want, or we would have our own personal vessel with which we can go up into the heavens, that type of thing. That's what I'm talking about here. Now, the next period is going to be recollection, and we're really getting into the future happenings now. The language for this will be life, or possibly you could say biological, although these words, again, are coming from this current time period, and they don't really fit into the concept, because after this you've always passed through the human language, meaning the operational language shared by humans, and now you're getting into an operational language shared by life forms. You're going to have interspecies, galactic war, multi-dimensional things going on. You've got planetary administration and celestial relationships. And this is way out there, way beyond the the thing that to us is unattainable at this point, which is the understanding of gravitational whatnot, things like that. Then after this, you have spatial architecture, which you're talking about the long forming of things across through space and time, and building concepts, and just this idea of immense vastness which can be shaped and formed. I believe at this point the Kabbalistic elements will be so far out of their depth that they will be incapable of restructuring any type of control mechanism, because even the whole idea of control mechanism is so mired in limited understanding that once you start getting into this architectural vast architectural comprehension, you are you're beyond the idea of somebody just being a leader or leading something, right? That's just doesn't mean anything. So that's what I believe will be essentially the end of the cabal, as it were, in this context. So, with this history of the cabal, the empire cycle, we'll just run through these periods. You've got the lost powers, search of lost powers. They lost something with which they can bring out the quote-unquote end of the world. Then you got the fishmonger stories. You've got the disintegration of the empire. You then have the Reformation, which includes Venice, Templars, Hussites, Huguenots, all that stuff, Habsburgs. Then you have the Republican Merchant Rebellion with the piracy, Barbary, smuggling, well, the Barbary pirates, so-called, even though that originally stems from the empire disintegration period with the Barbar and the Tartar. Trade wars, you got the Reconstruction period, the religious revival, civilized wars, etc. Then you got the People's Storm. After that, you have reunification. Now, here's something to note for the People's Storm period. When the so-called Nazi Germany era, when they began really arming in earnest, you see this very often with the in earnest arming. That just suddenly the individuals try to arm for various reasons. In 2020, it was considered the rampant criminal elements jumping out everywhere with the rioting and all that stuff, and people were just arming up as much as they could. But there's other ways to think about it, and that's the discovery of a plan, of the Kabbalistic plan. If you come along and say, oh, we're going to be attacked in all these different ways and all these different manners, first thing you're going to want for yourself is armament, whatever that may mean. So for the Cabal components, there's essentially 6 vocations. And this is the way that they do what they do. And it's interesting that these cycles could be totally broken if the Cabal structure, meaning all of the elements and everything related to it, could be broken up and destroyed. The first of these are storytellers. Storytellers are the ones that weave their false narratives, which are embedded through repetition and are, generally speaking, illogical and boring. But another word for it would be framer. And in this context, we're talking about the idea of the mafioso frame job, where you put a frame up on someone. And this word frame, of course, comes from a picture frame or a painting frame, in which you've got the canvas and the wood, if it's made out of wood, or the metal, or whatever it is, but you usually have like a square, or it could be a circle. It's got a border, all that stuff, and then you fill it up, and that's what a framer does. Next, you have the harvesters. This is going to be medicine, the individuals who extract various materials from humans, the blood collectors, the organ harvesters, the ones who harvest things from children, adrenochrome. Then you have the controllers, the ones who like to put signs up, the ones who likes to put up the stop signs and stoplights, who control people's movement. They operate in many other ways, but signs are a big way they work. Next, you've got the financiers or the leashers, and something you need to think about is that they're the operational component, the financier. They make sure all the wheels are greased, they make sure everything's connected, but they also leash the different components together to ensure that they don't step out of line and go off and do their own thing. Now, the next thing you have are the watchers. They have covert, meaning the with seen, vert being the French to see, covert is with seen. And they have, people embedded in communities to watch for patterns of conduct and things like that. And they also have other ways to sort of map the way people act. Next, you have the collectors, the scrubbers, the people who remove problematic objects and artifacts, and they're also, of course, the ones constantly searching for this end of the world technology. Now, from these 6, you have the head council formed, which are the heads of each of the vocational structures. And they sit there, and there's a 7th head whose position is to be occupied by the quote-unquote architect once that architect returns. So all of these heads of these vocational structures, their purpose is to hold with trust this organizational structure so that the architect of this organizational structure can just come back and take it over. And that's what they're doing. So that, I hope that makes sense, and that is formulated in a way that it can be understood well. Now, when it comes to these Kabbalistic components and their vocations, they all have some sort of enforcement mechanism. With the storytellers and framers, one of their enforcement mechanisms are things like intellectual property rights violations and censorship and stuff like that. They dwell within the realm of information and how that information is woven to change perspectives. Now, the harvesters, they also have their quote-unquote humane enforcement, which usually means, when they want, enforcement as in a force mechanism, a mechanism through which they can wage war. The harvesters can wage war through sickness, through poisoning. They have poisoners. They have individuals who go around and extract dangerous toxic substances, things like that. The controllers, their enforcement mechanism is what you would expect. It's just uniforms and people that go out thugs, uniformed thugs that go down kicking down doors and shoving guns in your face and blowing stuff up and things like that. The so-called police sheriffs, law enforcement, right? Those are the controllers' force mechanism. And it's with what they wage war is the force mechanism. And all they have to do is send out their instructions to those thugs to go around and attack whoever they want. The financiers have a very interesting force structure, being that it's based mostly around the de-incentivization of things, meaning they will revoke funding to one section or whatnot. Of course, they could also hire mercenaries and things like that, but mainly their force structure is built around starving out or sieging through a financial mechanism of some sort. Covert watchers, of course, have their assassins, their hidden killers. The collectors and scrubbers will have a force mechanism, but theirs is definitely in the realm of very strange mysticism type stuff, right? Where you get all of the stories about people who wield advanced technology and do really weird crap and like collect around magical objects and things like that. So the force mechanism for the collectors is going to be very odd, but it's mainly going to be built around the collective collection of things and objects and items, and they don't really care about any of the other stuff. They don't care so much about the control of the human population. So with the cover story and the frame-up job, there's a couple elements here about how to do it. First, you have the frame. Then you've got the character. The characters are the ones that will be put into the frame, that you will see through that frame. Then you have the background, which is everything that's going to be behind it. And then you have the alignment. The alignment is probably the most important part. You need your frame up to align with what you're putting it over. In the framing, you determine who is good and bad based off of that singular, narrow context of the frame, and includes anything that surrounds the context as well, right? The borders of the frame. For the character, you have the traits and aspects of the character, how you're going to design that. And copy and casting is replicating that character and determining who fits into that characterization. A characterization, for instance, would be the use of the word stereotype. You know, the country bumpkin, kind of like the straw hat and the sprig hanging out of the mouth. And you find this a lot with current censored media, where you have a lot of these LARPers or live action role player individuals who are embodying some type of character with the intent of either smearing or changing people's perspective towards that characterization one way or the other. But they are in fact part of the frame. Now the background will be around the motives, the storyline, you know, what is behind the characters and all that. Then you've got the alignment. One of the first elements for alignment is to determine what type you are matching up, whether it's going to be so-called law enforcement, a corporation, or some type of covert, quote-unquote, spy element, right? If you've got a real-world scenario in which you have, let's say you want to take control over the food supply in the real-world scenario. Well, you have to pick the type of frame you're going to use to describe these activities. You don't want to say, we're going to take over the food supply, right? You need some type of narrative, some type of situation in which you can do that. The quote-unquote cover story. And among those three options that I have here, of course, there's so many more, of the corporation, you know, you could have a corporate take over the food supply. You could have a covert or spy take over the food supply, or you could have a quote-unquote law enforcement takeover of the food supply. But either way, you are taking over the food supply, and the frame-up job is just how you're going to explain your takeover of the food supply and why you're good taking it over and everybody else is bad. The persona accuracy is going to be very important in this context, because if you're putting a frame-up job and you mischaracterize one of your elements, one of the individuals that you're attempting to slander, right? One of the individuals that you're attempting to frame, and you mischaracterize that person, right? You know, you got the warrior persona, the person who goes out and fights, and then you put that characterization onto some really, pacifistic type of individual who just is a vegetarian and they don't want to hurt anything and all this stuff, right? Then you got a mischaracterization. So that's something very important for this particular type of operation component. And all of these elements have their own way of essentially doing things. Right now we're under financial attack. And so when you're talking about this situation, you need to think about finance in the face of force, because what you're looking at is the force mechanism of the finance vocation. You've got the three fences, that's what I call it. You have fencing, which is fighting with the sword. You have a fence, being in a barrier, and you have the fence, meaning somebody who sells quote-unquote stolen goods. And all three concepts of the fence are very important if you're talking about financing in the face of finance force, because you are in fact in a situation in which all the quote-unquote conventional understandings won't work, because the financial control structure is, as it were, out to get you. There's four types of value. There's the value of use, there's the listed value of something, there's recognized value of something, or the monetary value, and then there's also going to be, I don't remember what the other value type was. I did a video on that before. Then you've got the spoils of fear, fraud, and force. Fraud, the most current context you have is the undervaluation of things, meaning certain things are undervalued while other things are overvalued. There's fear. People are afraid of not having money, or all of these other things. They're not so much afraid of, like not having food. So the whole market economy is being spoiled. And thus you get your word spoils of war, things that you're taking, right? That's what they're doing. They're taking right now. Then you got this idea of subscription or underwriting versus levy or leverage. So subscription versus levy or underwriting versus leverage. Leveraging meaning, of course, being the ability to hold and use something in an aggressive context. So for some examples of the levy, you have the constitutional levy, the U.S. Constitution's version of the levy, which is based out of the ability to tax based off of the census numbers alone. You've got the federal levy, which includes their so-called income tax and all these other nonsense. You've got the church levy, which has to do with donations and money laundering and a bunch of other stuff, which of course leads into the non-governmental organizations who do a similar type of levy. And most of these things are non-voluntary. They make you think they are. With the church, right, if you go into a church and they do their tithe collection, they do it in such a way that, you get social pressure. Everybody looks down on you, people ask you, like, why didn't you put anything in the collection basket? Stuff like that. That's sort of what I'm talking about with this levy. That's a socially enforced levy within the church structure. But they have other ways of doing that too, gift giving. You go up to pay with the nonprofits, which of course are all this stuff's connected to the Religion structure. You go and you want to pay for something, and some individual at the cash register looks at you like, do you want to round up to support this or that? And they've always got that like judgmental way they say it and look to you and stuff like that. And a lot of that's brainwashing too, the idea of the feeling that you should be giving, you should be helping, these types of things. So those are socially enforced levies. Banking is value for storage, or banking value. The design of banks is to hold value and store value. And thus you get this idea of land bank, which is holding and storing land. Rates of exchange. This is going to be stuff like determining what value something has equal to another value. The understanding of finance is not the management of financial assets, and it's not this thing we call money. The actual value is what we're talking about, and the leveraging and use of that value for operational purposes. The house is what's valuable. It's not the paperwork on the house. It is the use of value of a house is what makes a house useful. People buy a house for it to be used as a house, generally. This is a little bit different when it comes to something like food. A cook's knowledge is what has value. Without the cook's knowledge, all the ingredients, all the different products, they don't mix together. All you have is each singular separate. You can just, in that case, you buy celery, or you buy broccoli, or you buy some type of meat, and that object has intrinsic value alone relative to what that object can do. But when you start getting them together and you go to a restaurant to pay for something, what you're actually paying for there technically is the value of the cook. Because if the cook wasn't there to cook things, then you wouldn't go to the restaurant because nothing would ever get cooked. So really the singular value object there is the knowledge of the cook in a restaurant. And a knowledge of somebody that someone has for a particular service or production of something often is the tangible, or not really, the intangible value in that context. So business you can think of as it relates to people. Finance is trade and control. It's behind business. Business is dealing with people. It's doing stuff with people. All that stuff. The financial aspect is really, it's all about evaluation, moving things around. It doesn't actually, that a lot of people have business and finance conflated as if they're the same thing, but they're not. They are connected to each other, obviously, but they're not, you know, somebody's business is dependent upon their relationship with people, and most business owners don't understand this because they are propped up by a inimical financial structure who's propping them up specifically to cause damage to the business sector, so that those who are truly good at business can't thrive. They get suppressed, while people who are ignorant and incapable get lauded and cause destruction and damage with little swindles and problems and stuff. So it is a expansive financial war right now. So here we get this word infrastructure, which is relative to the word inframundo, underworld, or infranet, which is the undernet, a hidden internet system. So interestingly, a lot of people use the word infrastructure to relate to something that is seen, but it's not. It's actually an underneath structure. It's the control structure underneath, and thus you get the word as above, so below.